The first thing I noticed about her was that she did not flinch. I had ridden 3 days from the heart of Ironville to attend the Northern Council, and I arrived in the great hall of Ashford just as the ceremony of dissolution was beginning. I did not know what it was at the time. I had seen the gathering of wolves, 200, perhaps more, ringed in the torchlight of that stone-vaulted hall, and I had assumed it was the opening rite of the council itself. I was wrong. It was a rejection. The man standing at the dais was called Cavan. I knew him by reputation, a pack lord of moderate standing, ambitious enough to overreach, careful enough to survive it. He was handsome in a blunt, square-jawed way, and he stood with his shoulders back and his chin lifted as though the height of the dais made him something more than he was. Beside him stood a woman I did not yet know. She stood very still. She was not looking at Cavan. She was looking at nothing in particular at the middle distance above the heads of the assembled pack, as though she had already moved elsewhere inside herself, someplace no one in that hall could follow. Her hair was dark and braided back with a single silver pin. Her dress was gray wool, plainly cut, the kind a woman wears when she has learned that ornamentation only invites commentary. She held her hands folded in front of her, and her face was composed, not frozen, not blank, but quiet in the way a deep river is quiet. Everything moving beneath the surface, nothing breaking above it. Cavan spoke. I stand before the pack to formally dissolve my claim. There was a murmur through the hall. My wolf lifted his head. The woman called Sira Aviath has been my intended for 2 years. In that time she has proven herself. Cavan paused, and something shifted in his voice, something I did not like. Capable. Exceptional even. She finished her healer's qualification with highest distinction. She speaks 4 of the old tongues. She earned the tracker's seal before her 23rd year, and the archive scholars have cited her work on the binding rituals twice in as many seasons. He let the list hang in the air, and then his voice went flat. She is too much. The hall went very quiet. I am a pack lord, Cavan said, and I have my pride. A man cannot stand beside a woman who outshines him in every room he enters. There is no shame in her. The shame would be mine to stand always a step behind. So I dissolve the claim. She is no one's intended now. He stepped back. He had said it as though it were dignified, as though the measured tone made it reasonable, as though listing her accomplishments as the reason for her rejection was something other than what it was. A man telling a woman, in front of 200 wolves, that she was worth less because she was worth more. I looked at Sira. She had not moved. She had not looked at him. She had not flinched when he named her qualifications like indictments, had not trembled when the hall went quiet around her, had not turned her face away or pressed her lips together or done any of the small things that people do when they are trying not to come apart in public. She simply stood there in her gray wool dress, with her hands folded and her eyes fixed on some private horizon, and she waited until Cavan stepped back. Then she inclined her head, barely, a small and perfect economy of acknowledgement, and she stepped off the dais and walked toward the far door of the hall. The pack parted for her, quietly, uncertainly, the way people part for something they do not know how to face. She did not look at any of them. She did not look at me either, though I was standing near the entrance, and she passed within 10 feet of where I stood. She simply walked, straight-backed, unhurried, as though she were leaving a room where the business had been concluded and she had somewhere else to be. The door closed behind her. Something in my chest did not know what to do with itself. My wolf had gone very still. Not the stillness of threat or wariness, but a different kind. The stillness of a creature that has scented something it has been waiting years to scent and cannot yet believe the finding. A warmth moved through my ribs, slow and certain, and the mark on my wrist, the one every alpha king carries, bound to the mate bond, dormant since the day I was crowned, pulsed once, like a heartbeat that had just remembered itself. I did not understand it yet, but I remembered it. The Northern Council ran for 7 days. I had duties enough to fill them. Border agreements with the Highland packs, the question of the eastern trade routes, a long-standing dispute over the wolf pine forests between Ashford's lord and his neighbor to the south. I sat in the council chambers, and I listened, and I spoke, and I made the decisions that my position required of me. And all of it happened at some remove from the part of my mind that kept returning to the gray-dressed woman who had walked out of that hall without flinching. I began to see her on the 2nd day. The healing rooms at Ashford were housed in the east wing of the hold, a long, low-ceilinged suite of chambers that smelled of dried herbs and clean linen. I passed through them on my way to the archive on the morning of the second day, and I heard her before I saw her. Her voice, giving clear and quiet instructions to an apprentice about the preparation of a wound-cleansing compound, the proportions, the order of ingredients, the reason behind each step. The apprentice was young and nervous and kept second-guessing herself, and Sira simply answered each second guess with patience, without impatience, without any of the subtle corrections that carry the weight of not now. I slowed my pace without meaning to. On the third day I passed through the archive. She was there, at a table near the west window, with 3 open manuscripts and a small stack of her own notes, writing quickly in a hand I was too far away to read. She did not look up. On the 4th day I had a cut on my forearm, minor, a training accident that morning, not worth troubling anyone with. My second tried to bandage it and made a thorough mess of the wrapping, and by late afternoon it had loosened entirely. I found myself in the East Wing, without having fully decided to go there. Sira was there alone. She looked at the arm, looked at me with an expression that held no particular warmth and no particular coldness either, simply assessment, the way a healer looks at something that requires her attention, and she unwrapped my second's work without comment and redressed the cut with quick and expert hands. "It's not deep," she said. "No," I said. "You didn't need to come to the healing rooms for this." "No," I said again. There was a pause in which she tied off the bandage, and neither of us said anything. "You're the Alpha King," she said, not a question. "Aldrich," I said. She looked up. Her eyes were a dark amber, the color of late autumn, and they were entirely steady. She regarded me for a moment as though she were weighing something, and then she looked back down at her work. "The binding's clean," she said. "Change it tomorrow morning." "Thank you," I said. She nodded, and that was the end of the conversation, and I walked back through the East Wing and told myself that what I was feeling was ordinary interest, the kind a king takes in someone competent enough to notice. I did not believe it. My wolf did not believe it. The mark on my wrist had warmed the moment she touched my arm. Not painfully, nothing so dramatic as that, but it was unmistakable, a slow and specific heat that I had never felt from that mark in all my years as king, and it had intensified when she looked up at me, and it had faded unwillingly as I walked away. I had been Alpha King for 11 years. I had waited 11 years for the mate bond to find me, through every council and every border war and every winter, through the years when my advisors pressed me to choose a Luna by arrangement, through the years when I had begun to wonder whether the bond would come at all or whether I was simply the sort of king who would reign alone and leave the throne to his brother's sons. And now, in Ashford's East Wing, over a minor cut on my arm, something had shifted that I had no good way to name. I went to the archive that evening. She was there again, and this time I sat at the adjacent table and found a text I had been meaning to examine for years, and we worked in silence for an hour and a half. She did not speak to me, and I did not speak to her, and the silence was not uncomfortable. It was, in fact, the most comfortable silence I had experienced in years, not the silence of 2 strangers who have run out of words, but the silence of 2 people who do not need to fill space to make their presence tolerable to each other. At the end of it, she closed her manuscripts and gathered her notes, and as she stood she said, without looking at me, "There is a passage in the Vethric Codex that addresses the binding rituals you were reading. Page 47 of the 2nd volume. It is misdated, but the content is accurate." Then she left. I found page 47. She was right. On the 5th day, I sought her out deliberately. I told myself it was because I wanted to ask her about the Vethric Codex. This was not entirely false. I did want to ask her about it, but it was not entirely the reason either, and I was too honest with myself to pretend otherwise. She was in the healer's garden, a narrow courtyard on the south side of the hold where the medicinal plants were kept. The morning light was coming at a low angle through the stone arch that framed the garden's entrance, and it found her there among the gray-green herbs with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, working methodically through some task I could not immediately identify. She heard my footsteps and looked up without startling. "The Vethric passage," I said. "You know the binding ritual section well." "It's relevant to my work," she said. She went back to her task, harvesting something I saw now with careful hands. "Are you asking whether I've translated it?" Have you? Partially, she set a cut bundle down and moved to the next plant. The third section is written in a dialect that was extinct before the Great Pax formed. Most scholars read it as allegorical. I think it's literal. Literal how? She glanced at me. Literal in the sense that the bond described in the ritual is not metaphorical. The physical mark, the warmth, the recognition. She looked away again. Most scholars would rather it be a poem. It is more comfortable as a poem. The warmth in my wrist was very present. You believe in the mate bond? I said. I believe in evidence, she said. The bond is documented in 4 independent source traditions. That is either evidence or a remarkable coincidence, and I have never found coincidence a very satisfying explanation for anything. She stood and brushed the soil from her hands and looked at me with that calm amber steadiness, and something in her expression shifted, barely, a fractional change, there and then controlled. Why are you here, Alpha King? She said, and I mean in this garden, not in Ashford. Aldrich, I said. She looked at me. You called me Alpha King the other day, I said. My name is Aldrich. A long pause. Aldrich, she said. It was only my name, 4 syllables, and she said it quietly, without inflection, as though she were testing the weight of it. But the mark on my wrist blazed. I held very still. Why are you here? She said again, more quietly, in this garden. Because I wanted to talk to you, I said, about the Codex and other things. Other things, she repeated. The council is long, I said, and you are, I stopped. I was choosing words with unusual care. You are not easy to stop thinking about. She looked at me for a long moment. Her expression was not cold and it was not warm. It was something more careful than either. I was rejected 5 days ago, she said. In front of 200 wolves, I have spent 2 years in a claim with a man who found me excessive. I am not available to be someone's curiosity, Alpha King, however. She stopped, and then continued. However sincere. I know, I said. Then you understand why I am telling you to be careful, she said. I understand it, I said. I am not here as a curiosity. She held my gaze for another moment, then looked back at her garden. Come to the archive tonight, she said. If it is the Codex you want to discuss, we can discuss it there. I came to the archive that night. We discussed the Codex. We discussed the binding rituals in the 3rd section and their 3 possible interpretations, and we discussed the extinct dialect and her theory about its literal meaning, and we discussed the question of whether the warmth the ancient texts described was metaphor or documented fact. We talked for 3 hours, and she was precise and unsparing in her thinking, and she challenged 2 of my interpretations and was entirely right to do so. And sometime in the 2nd hour she had pushed her notes to one side and turned on her stool to face me more fully, and sometime in the 3rd hour she had stopped watching me with quite so much caution. And when we finally went quiet, the silence between us was the same comfortable silence as before. The silence of people for whom the other's company is not a burden. She looked at the mark on my wrist. It was warm, it was almost certainly visible. I had heard of the bond mark warming to visibility before recognition, though I had never seen it. I did not move my arm. She did not comment on it. She gathered her things and stood and said quietly, "Good night, Aldrich." And I said, "Good night, Sira." And that was all it was for that night. But I lay awake for a long time afterward, my wrist warm in the dark, and I thought about what the Vethric Codex said in its literal reading, that the bond is not chosen, it is recognized, that the recognition does not announce itself in ceremony or in thunder, but in the small accumulation of unmistakable things. A silence that is comfortable, a name said once quietly that changes the temperature of a room. On the 6th day, Cavan sought me out. He found me in the council courtyard, and he approached with the particular manner of a man who has prepared what he is going to say. He was polite. He said that he hoped the council was going to my satisfaction, that the northern Pax were grateful for my presence, that the eastern trade routes were a matter he felt confident could be resolved to everyone's benefit. Then he said, carefully, that he had noticed I was spending time in the archive and in the healer's wing. I waited. Sira Aviath, he said, is a good healer, a fine scholar. I hope the Alpha King has found her useful. She is exceptional, I said. Something crossed his face, a flash of something he controlled quickly. She is, he said. It is her chief quality and also her chief difficulty. She is the kind of woman who is better placed as a specialist than as a Luna, better suited to the archive than to the hall. He smiled. It did not reach his eyes. I am sure she has been very helpful to the Alpha King's research. She has, I said. She will be invaluable. He paused. Invaluable, he repeated. To Ironville, I said, and I watched his face. I intend to ask her to come north. There was a silence. As a healer, Cavan said. As whatever she chooses to be, I said. I do not make that decision for her. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said very carefully, the Alpha King should know that Syrah's dissolvement was concluded in full accordance with Pack law. The claim is over. She is, he seemed to search for the word, unspoken for. I know, I said. I am aware of what she is and what she is not. I held his gaze. I do not think you are. I turned and went back to the council hall, and I did not look at him again. That evening I found Syrah in the archive, and I told her what I had said. I did not dress it. I told her I had told Cavan I intended to ask her to come north, and that I had said she would be invaluable to Ironville, and that I had meant every word. She was quiet for a moment. You told him that, she said. I did. Before asking me. Before asking you, I said. I should have asked you first. I am asking now. She looked at her notes. She was quiet a little longer than was comfortable, and I waited in the quiet. I have been at Ashford my whole life, she said finally. I know. I have my work here, the archive, the healing rooms. I am not, she stopped. I am not a woman who goes somewhere because a man has expressed an interest. I learned the cost of that arrangement. You wouldn't go because I expressed an interest, I said. You would go because Ironville's archive holds 3 collections that Ashford's does not, and our healing rooms are the best staffed in the northern holds, and because... I paused, and then I said it honestly, because I would like very much for you to be there, in whatever capacity you choose, including none that I specify. Silence. That is a careful distinction, she said. It is the right one, I said. She looked at me across the archive table, and something shifted in her expression, slower this time, more deliberate. Ask me again, she said, after the council closes. I will, I said. She nodded and looked back at her work. My wrist was so warm it almost burned. On the 7th day, the council closed. It closed as all northern councils closed, with a gathering in the great hall. The full assembly, every alpha and elder and pack lord who had attended, gathered in the stone-vaulted room where they had arrived a week before, and the closing rites were spoken, and the agreements were sealed, and the business of 7 days was formalized in the old words that wolf packs have used since before the holds were built. I stood at the head of the hall as the Alpha King's place demanded, and I looked out across 200 wolves and I waited. I had not spoken to Syrah today. She was somewhere in the hall. I had seen her arrive, gray dress, silver pin in her hair, the same quiet composure that she wore like armor without seeming to know it was armor. And then the gathering had closed around us both, and I had lost sight of her. The rites were nearly finished. Then Cavan moved. He stepped forward from his place among the pack lords, and he raised his hand for the floor in the way that signified a speaker, and the Ashford elder who was presiding gave him a nod. Before the council closes, Cavan said, I wish to make a declaration of intent. I went still. As the assembled packs know, I dissolved my claim at the opening of this council. I have since had opportunity to reflect. He straightened his shoulders. I intend to take a new Luna from among the Southern Pack Lord's daughters, and I want it known that the dissolution of my claim on Syrah Aviath stands as testament to, and here his voice went smooth and deliberate, the importance of compatibility. A man of standing must have a Luna who complements his position, who supports rather than overshadows. He looked directly at Syrah across the hall. I wish her every success in whatever specialty she chooses, the archive or the healer's rooms. He smiled. She will do well there. The hall murmured. I knew what it was. He had watched me speaking with her all week, and he had panicked, and this was a man in panic looking for a way to cut the ground from under her one more time before I could reach it, to name her, publicly, as a woman suited to a room and not a throne, so that if I then stepped forward the narrative would already be set. He was not subtle. He was, in fact, desperate, and desperation had made him cruel in a way that he had dressed up as generosity. I looked at Syrah. She was standing very still. She was looking at nothing particular. Her hands were folded in front of her. Her face was composed. She was not going to flinch. And something in my chest, which had been building for 7 days, quietly came undone. I moved. I was not aware, precisely, of deciding to move. The mark on my wrist had gone from warmth to fire the moment Cavan started speaking, and it reached an intensity that left no ambiguity about what it was or what it required. And so I moved, not fast, not dramatically, not in the way of a man making a scene, but with the steady, unavoidable pace of a king who has made a decision and is walking toward it. The hall parted. Cavan saw me coming, and the color left his face. I walked through the full length of that stone hall, with 200 wolves watching, and I came to a stop in front of Sira. She looked up at me. She had eyes like late autumn, steady as deep water, and she was looking at me with an expression that held surprise and something careful beneath the surprise. The wariness of a woman who has been surprised before in public and learned the cost. I held out my wrist. The bond mark was blazing, a pale gold light visible against my skin, the same light the Vethric Codex described in its literal reading, the mark of recognition that could not be faked and could not be forced and had not appeared on the wrist of an Alpha King in 4 generations. The hall had gone completely silent. Sira looked at my wrist. Then she looked at her own. Her mark, every wolf carries the potential. It is the bond that wakes it, was glowing with the same pale gold, low and steady, like an ember that has been kept alive a long time without anyone knowing it was there. She looked back at me. Sira Avieth, I said. My voice was very quiet. The hall was so silent that quiet was enough. The bond does not overshadow, it finds. Something moved across her face, not surprise anymore, something older and more precise. It finds, she said, barely audible. What was said before this assembly, I said, is not what this assembly will remember. What it will remember is this. I took her hand. Not quickly, not with any force. I offered it, open palm upward, as you offer something you mean to give and not to take. And she placed her hand in mine, and the mark on my wrist blazed fully, and the mark on hers answered it, and the warmth moved between our joined hands like a current that has finally found the circuit it was made for. The hall did not move. Then, beginning at the front and moving backward like a tide, every wolf in that assembly bowed. Not to me, they bowed to her. She felt it, I could tell from the way her breath shifted, from the slight trembling in her hand that was not fear but something rower than fear and harder to name. She stood very straight, and she did not look away from me, and she held herself together with the same composure that she had held herself together with 5 minutes ago, and 7 days ago, and probably her whole life. I wanted to tell her she did not have to hold herself together on my account, that we had time, that there was no more need for the gray wool dress and the armor of composure, not here, not with me. But we had time for all of that. I looked at the Ashford elder, who was standing at the dais with an expression that could only be described as reverent bewilderment. Record it, I said. The bond has found its mate, Sira Avieth of Ashford, the fated mate of Aldrich Alpha King of Ironville. The elder inclined his head. It is recorded. I looked at Cavan. He was standing very still. He had the look of a man who has said something he cannot unsay in front of people who will never forget it, and the color was still gone from his face, and he was looking at the mark on Sira's wrist as though it had said something to him that required more time than he had to absorb. I did not say anything to him. He had said everything that needed saying already, and the hall had heard it, and the hall had heard everything that came after it, and some moments do not require addition. I looked back at Sira. You said to ask you again after the council closed, I said. She looked at me. Something behind her composure was very close to the surface now. The council, she said quietly, is closed. Then I am asking, I said, come north, come to Ironville. Come to the archive and the healing rooms and the wolf pine forests and whatever else calls you. Come because you choose it, not because anyone has named it for you. I held her hand more carefully. Come because this is real, and you know it is, and we have both known it was real from the moment it began. She was quiet for a long moment. Around us the hall was very still, 200 wolves holding a breath together. I know the Vethric Codex, she said. Her voice was steady, but something in it was soft in a way I had not heard from her before. The literal interpretation. So do I said. It says the bond is not chosen, she said. It says it is recognized. It does, I said. She looked at our joined hands. The pale gold light was warm and even, like something that has settled into what it was always meant to be. I recognize it, she said. And the hall breathed. We rode north a week later. She brought 3 trunks of manuscripts and the apprentice she had been training, and a small silver pin that had been her grandmother's that she wore in her hair against the cold. She did not bring much else. She had never had much that was hers alone. Most of what she possessed had been accumulated in service to others. That would change. I rode beside her through the wolf pine forest on the last day of the journey, when the towers of Ironville came into view above the ridge, and I watched her see them for the first time. The gray stone and the high walls and the torches beginning to be lit against the late afternoon, and her face held the expression of someone seeing something they had not known they were looking for. The archive, I said, is in the North Tower, 4 floors. 4, she said. The Vethric collections are on the 3rd, I said, including the volumes you do not have here. She looked at me. Her amber eyes were warm in the late light. You researched what I was missing, she said. I paid attention, I said. A pause. Aldrich, she said. Yes. Thank you, she said it simply, without ceremony, and she looked back at the towers of Ironville coming closer through the trees. I thought about Cavan, standing silent in that hall with the color gone from his face while 200 wolves bowed to the woman he had named as too much. I thought about what he had meant by that phrase, too skilled, too capable, too brilliant for a man of his standing to stand beside, and I thought about how much the phrase had revealed and how little it had understood. A man who finds a woman's excellence, a burden has not yet learned what excellence is for. It is not for diminishing, it is not for standing behind. I rode through the gates of Ironville beside the woman the bond had chosen for me, and my wolf was quiet and warm, and the mark on my wrist was settled, no longer urgent, no longer searching, simply present, the way a fire settles when it has finally found the hearth it was built for. The pack assembled in the courtyard as we arrived. They had been told. They knew what they were seeing, their alpha king returning, and beside him the woman the bond mark had blazed for, the fated mate, the Luna. They bowed. Sira sat very straight in her saddle, and she did not look away from them, and I saw her accept it, not with pride, not with triumph, but with the quiet steadiness of a woman who has learned to receive things without flinching, and who is finally being given something worth receiving. I helped her down from her horse. She stood in the courtyard of Ironville, in the gray light of early evening, and she looked around at the stone walls and the torches and the assembled wolves who had bowed their heads, and then she looked at me. 4 floors, she said. 4 floors, I said, and I have been waiting 11 years for someone who would know what to do with them. She did not smile quite, but her eyes did. I walked beside her into Ironville, and the doors of the hold closed behind us, and somewhere in the great hall of Ashford, a man who had once called her too brilliant for him was living with what he'd said, in front of 200 wolves who had not forgotten it. And Sira Aviath, who had never begged, who had never flinched, who had accepted a public rejection with a dignity so complete it had stopped my breath on the first day I saw her. Sira Aviath walked into the North Tower of Ironville, and she pressed her palm to the door of the archive, and the door swung open on 4 floors of waiting knowledge, and the mark on both our wrists glowed soft and settled and warm. That is the thing about the bond, in its literal reading. It does not find the loudest. It does not find the most convenient or the most manageable or the easiest to stand beside. It finds the truest. And when it does, there is nothing left to say except, yes, you, I recognize you. She was always too brilliant for him. She was never too brilliant for this. The North Tower archive became hers within a week. I do not mean that she claimed it. Sira was not a woman who claimed things. I mean that it recognized her, the way the bond had recognized her, the way every room she entered eventually organized itself around her quiet presence. By the 4th day, the scholars who worked the 3rd floor had begun leaving notes on her table. By the 6th day, 2 of them were attending what had quietly become her morning discussion hour, though no one had announced it as such. By the end of the week, the archive's head scholar, a man named Orveth who had guarded his domain with territorial precision for 30 years, had given her a key to the restricted collection without being asked. I heard about it from my steward, She didn't request it, I said. She corrected a misdating in one of the restricted texts, my steward said. From memory, Orvith gave her the key the same afternoon. I thought about this, and I thought about Cavan standing in the Ashford Hall saying she outshines every room she enters. And I thought about how a man who sees that as a problem and a man who sees that as a gift are looking at the same woman and seeing entirely different things. I said nothing about the key. It was hers. It had always been going to be hers. The difficulty came in the third week. It did not announce itself as a difficulty. It arrived, as most difficulties do, wearing the face of something ordinary, a delegation from the Southern Holds, 6 pack lords and their seconds, come to discuss the Eastern trade agreements that the Northern Council had left unfinished. Routine. I had hosted a dozen such delegations. I prepared the council chambers and the guest quarters, and I thought nothing of it. Then I met the delegation's head. His name was Lord Farron of the Caldmore Pack, and he was tall and silver-haired and courteous in the manner of a man who has practiced courtesy so long it has become indistinguishable from sincerity. He greeted me at the gates of Ironville with the correct words and the correct bow, and then he looked past my shoulder and his eyes found Sira, who had come down to the courtyard because I had asked her to. She had read more of the Eastern trade documentation than anyone in my hold, and I wanted her counsel at hand. His eyes stayed on her a moment too long. "The Alpha Kings," he began. "The Alpha King's mate," I said. "Sira of Ironville, my fated Luna." He inclined his head to her, correctly, politely, and then he smiled, and the smile was the kind that holds a private calculation behind it, and I did not like it. Sira noticed. She noticed everything, but she said nothing, and she gave him the composed courtesy she gave everyone, and we went inside. The delegation stayed 4 days. On the second day, Lord Farron found Sira in the archive. I learned of it afterward from Orvith, who had been present. Farron had come in under the pretense of reviewing a trade document. Plausible enough. The archive held commercial records as well as scholarship, and he had found Sira at her table, and he had sat across from her, and he had begun to talk. He was, by Orvith's account, charming. He asked about her work. He expressed admiration for her qualifications, the healer's distinction, the tracker's seal, the language scholarship, in the tone of a man who finds these things impressive rather than excessive. He was, Orvith said, very good at it. Sira had been courteous. She had answered his questions briefly. She had not encouraged him. Then he had leaned forward and said quietly that he had heard what happened at Ashford, that he thought it was a shame, that a woman of her qualities deserved, and here he had used a word that Orvith did not fully catch, but whose meaning was clear enough, options. Sira had looked at him. Then she had said, "Lord Farron, I am going to tell you something that I mean kindly because I think you are a capable man who has made an error in judgment." She had set down her pen. "I am not a woman who was rescued. I am not a woman who requires options or alternatives or the suggestion that what I have found might be improved upon. I am a woman who was recognized by the bond, and by a king who understood the difference between a woman who outshines a room and a woman who was made for one." She had picked her pen back up. "I would appreciate it if you would take your trade document and conclude your business with the Alpha King's steward." Orvith told me he had never been so glad to witness a conversation he had no part in. I found Sira that evening on the courtyard wall, where she had taken to walking when she wanted cold air and open sky. The wolf-pine forest was dark below the ridge, and the first stars were coming through, and she was standing at the parapet with her arms folded and her face turned north. I stood beside her. "Orvith told you," she said. "He did," I said. Silence. The cold came off the stone. "I handled it," she said. "I know," I said. "I'm not here because I thought you hadn't." She looked at me. "Then why are you here?" "Because," I said, "you have been standing on this wall for 40 minutes, and it is below freezing, and I wanted to stand here with you." A pause. Something in her expression shifted, that small, deliberate shift that I was learning to read, the one that meant she was letting something in that she had not fully decided to let in yet. "He thought I was unsatisfied," she said, "that I had simply traded one arrangement for a better one, that I could be made to see other arrangements still." "He doesn't understand what the bond is," I said. "No," she said, "he doesn't." She was quiet a moment. "Cavan didn't understand it either. He thought the bond mark was theater, Status. He looked at my wrist in that hall like it was a document that had been filed incorrectly. Cavan is going to spend a long time in that hall, I said, in the company of 200 wolves who remember exactly what he said and exactly what came after it. Something close to a smile moved across her face, there and then controlled. Is that meant to comfort me? It is meant to be accurate, I said. She laughed. It was the first time I had heard her laugh, a small, real sound, unguarded, nothing performed about it, and it did something to the region of my chest that I was not entirely prepared for. She looked at me, and she saw my expression, and the laugh faded into something quieter and warmer. Aldrich, she said. Yes. I am not unsatisfied, she said, simply, directly, the way she said everything that mattered. The bond mark was warm on my wrist. The forest was dark and cold below us, and the stars were coming in fast now, and she was standing beside me on the wall of Ironville in her gray wool dress with the silver pin in her hair, and she was looking at me with those steady amber eyes, and I thought that there was no version of the 11 years I had waited that I would trade for any earlier arrival, because every year had been necessary to make this the precise moment it was. Neither am I said. She unfolded her arms and she leaned very slightly against my side. Not dramatically, not with declaration, just the small settled weight of someone who has decided, quietly and finally, that this is where she belongs. I did not move. I did not make it a moment. I simply stood there, and she stood there, and the wolf pine forest stretched dark and cold below us, and the stars finished arriving, and that was enough. That was, in fact, everything,